A colleague of mine shared an interesting Reddit question, which was, is there a script that can automatically add negatives for search terms that contain 6 or more terms? It does bring up an interesting question. What does the performance look like on these different kinds of search terms? In order to get the cleanest data to take a look at, I decided to stick with shopping campaigns, just because there are so many different match type style strategies within text campaigns that can skew the results very, very badly. We're looking at $20 million worth of transactions, all within the past year and from a broad spectrum of accounts. So at first I looked at the longest possible search terms. It got up to 32 words long, but the ones that were making up 10 words or more were only 0.79% of revenue and only 0.62% of spend. And anytime the percent of revenue is greater than the percent of spend, that means that the segment you're looking at has a higher average return on ad spend than the overall average, which means that these very, very long terms, 10 words or more, are actually more efficient than the overall average. The next thing I did was I looked at search terms that were 6 to 9 words long. We are looking at the ones that the Reddit user would have been negating, but that still made up a chunk of revenue that we care about. So these 6 to 9 word long terms produced 9.7% of revenue and about 8.8% of spend. So once again, more efficient than the overall average. But that begs the question, if both the very, very long search terms and the fairly long search terms are better than average, what does the overall spread look like? And so I grabbed 1 to 9. You'll note that the lowest return on ad spend is actually at the shortest search terms, and it tends to climb and then roll off at around 4 or 5 words long. Impressions and clicks are about as atomic as it gets, and here we are already seeing some unexpected behavior. The impressions peak at a search term length of 2, and the clicks peak at a search term length of 3. We can guess what the click-through rate is going to look like to some degree, at least insofar as the fact that we know that the 3-word search terms click-through rates are going to be much, much better than the 2-word search terms click-through rates. And so if we jump down to that, we actually see exactly that. We see the click-through rate of 3 being much, much higher than click-through rate of 2, but we also see this continuation of that climb as you get up towards 6 and 7, and then it appears to roll off, and then from there it gets a little bit noisy. And so if I actually zoom out here, it doesn't look like a weird cliff at 9. It looks like a very noisy but still gradually increasing pattern. And so I wanted to just acknowledge that by the time you get out there, some of these beautiful S curves that we're producing are partially the result of us looking only at the buckets that have the largest amount of data. So it does look like the long tail has some opportunity, at least in terms of click-through rate. And so our hypothesis here is the same as it was for the return on ad spend, in that the competition must be less when you get to those longer and longer search terms. It's either that, or it might be something related to the specificity of the search term, improving the relevance of the ad that they see. But I think we can at least take a look at the CPCs to decide whether or not we think that competition is the bigger factor there. If we do, then we should see higher CPCs at the beginning, at the shortest end, that should gradually roll off as we get to the longer terms. And here I've plotted both the cost per click and the value per click, that's just revenue divided by the click count, so that we can see how those two behave together. And while value per click seems to climb slightly and is generally flat-ish, the CPC is very, very clearly starting high and then smoothing out, and then by about 4 words, it just hits a dead level, flat plane, and doesn't change until you basically run out of sample size again. Competition is more fierce for those shorter search terms, and therefore the longer search terms have some potential value. Because even though that increase in VPC is fairly minor, the fact that the CPC goes down and then stays down is why we see that return on ad spend curve take the shape that it does. Next, I wanted to look at conversion rate and average order value. If we see a relatively flat VPC, that makes me wonder whether or not that means that the AOV and conversion rate are also flat, or whether the average order value and conversion rate are behaving differently but somehow cancel each other out. And it seems to be the latter. In fact, it looks like conversion rate starts out low and then climbs and rolls off a little bit, but it does it a little bit more dramatically than value per click. And the reason for that is because it's being partially mitigated by the changes in average order value. For the most part, we are seeing that conversion rate climbs with more specificity in the search term, and the average order value declines. Now, the conversion rate we've already discussed, it may be that more specific search terms convert better, That makes sense to me. But I honestly don't have a very good hypothesis on why the average order value would be lower. And finally, I wanted to introduce another metric that I use a lot, especially for ad copy testing, and that's RPM, revenue per 1,000 impressions. The M is for 1,000 impressions, kind of like it would be for CPM, for example. And the reason I like revenue per 1,000 impressions for this kind of thing is for the same reason I like it for ad copy testing. It can influence both the ad copy, that is, can influence both the click-through rate and the conversion rate. And if you're only optimizing against the click-through rate, you might not be optimizing for the whole picture. Now, if this curve looks familiar, it's because it looks almost identical to the click-through rate curve. The reason for that is the change over the word length for the conversion rate was fairly minor. It was maybe plus 20% by the time you got up to 4, 5, 6 words, whereas the change in the click-through rate was many times higher click-through rates for those longer terms than it was for the short terms. The bottom line is that we don't find any evidence to suggest that those longer search terms are a bad thing that you should be negating unless you're up to something terribly clever. If you're doing something terribly clever, just be sure that you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater.